let's talk about death. So, who would you say deserves to die, and on what grounds does a human deserve to live, for that matter? You might say, oh, well, a person has inherent value. A lot of Christians in circle, maybe at Eastern University, say, the human life is to be valued, regardless of the situation. And some might say, well, there's inherent sin. We all deserve to die. That's the wages of sin is death, as Romans 6:23 says. Or maybe if a person's at a point of total corruption, maybe from a secular viewpoint, they're just so corrupt, they're beyond repair, there's no hope for them, and there's no remorse, they deserve to die. Maybe you say there's a potential for change in everybody, a more optimistic approach in a secular sense. Well, what if, thinking hypothetically, and this might be a really heavy image, but just think of, what if the person that you love the most, and that could be anybody, your spouse, family member, anyone, what if that person was raped, tortured, and killed? Or even worse yet, that the person committing the act showed no remorse? Would that change your answer to that question about the person who committed the act? Would that maybe make you think, maybe that person deserves to die? Maybe not, but for me, as horrifying as it may be, I would choose for that person to live. When it comes to the death penalty, we have no right to choose who lives or dies for a number of reasons, which I'll lay out. First of the reasons that the death penalty should not be in place, either in the United States or around the world, is that the death penalty often can target the marginalized. First, we can see that the death penalty is going by the wayside in many countries, as according to Robin Mayer from the Penal Reform International Organization, the worldwide trend is going away from the use of the death penalty, and that 141 countries out of the 197 recognized by the United Nations now have abolished it in law and in practice. And an overwhelming majority of death row inmates in the US and abroad are in poverty. Some say close to in the 90th percentile. Blacks are 3 to 4 times as likely to be sentenced to death as whites charged in similar cases, according to the Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. So we can see there's also some racial disparity in that conversation as well. And so if there's bias in these situations, this is not the time to have bias when lives are at stake and possibly innocent lives could be lost. Or perhaps we're playing God, if that's the approach we want to have. But it's easy to see how this dynamic of being in poverty or being marginalized greatly can affect someone's likelihood of getting on death row and eventually maybe even being executed. Situations like not having as good of lawyers, or maybe not having lawyers that are rightfully advocating for them. Maybe less educational opportunities, being able to get to that position where they could find a lawyer, or having less financial opportunities for that. And maybe not having as much social capital, or being looked differently upon by judges or other people in the jury. All plays a role into how the death penalty is implemented. So already we can see it's unfair. Second of all, the death penalty does not serve public safety the way that many people might think it would. In fact, most research shows that there's not really a measurable effect on crime or murder rates, whether it's implemented or not. And in fact, a 2018 report from the Abdurrahman Borman Center in Washington, D.C. It's a Washington, D.C. based organization that promotes human rights and democracy in Iran. It showed that the murder rates actually dropped in most all countries that abolished the death penalty instead of increasing it. So when we think of these numbers, it's mainly based on a lot of factors that may or may not have to do with the death penalty at all, but the point is, and that thing that we can see from most of the research, is that the public is no safer or more unsafe by having the death penalty or not having it. And so if there's not enough support for that, then that argument that people kind of bring up safety of the people in the society doesn't really hold weight. And thirdly, another issue with the death penalty is that innocent people are sentenced to death. And in fact, 166 people since 1977 have been exonerated after being sentenced to death just in the United States. To give you perspective, that's one innocent person out of every 9 people executed. That's an alarming rate. So people justify this by saying that innocent deaths are maybe a price that has to be paid in order to achieve justice or keep the public safe. But innocent deaths for, as we've talked about before, no real benefit to the public is just as immoral as the murders that got the prisoners there in the first place. And if the people advocating for the death penalty are fine with sentencing others to death for killing innocent lives, then they too should be willing to receive the death penalty for wrongly executing victims. That's not me advocating for the death penalty in any way, it's just pointing out the hypocrisy of some of the arguments from the other side. Lastly of all, and most importantly, personally for me, I see no biblical justification for it. According to prisonfellowship.org, they point out 5 main points to keep in mind biblically when thinking about the death penalty that I really liked, I thought I would pull from. So first is proportionality. In the Old Testament, in the laws in the Old Testament, penalty usually was, must have been proportional to the offense. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, verses like that. There's also, second of all, certainty of guilt. There had to be a high standard of proof. At least a couple people at a time had to witness the event occurring and give witness to it and stand trial. There also had to be intent. You couldn't implement capital punishment for things that were accidental or incidental. We can point to verses like that. Due process as well was the fourth one. Executions were taking place after appropriate judicial procedures, which you saw are not happening in the U.S. or even across the world in other countries where the death penalty is implemented. And finally, a reluctance to implement the death penalty or to end someone's life because of something they've done. Ezekiel 33:11 says that God says that as sure as I live, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. And so God is not advocating for this. It's something that he has to do as part of his being and who he is, not something that he wants to do or that he would promote. It's something that must be done for his justice and his holy justice. But again, more than that, and more than just those 5 things, this is God giving out these instructions, not man. And these are his Old Testament instructions and Mosaic law. And we have not been given the right to decide between life and death for others. We cannot see the inner workings of someone's heart like God can, regardless of how cold-blooded they may appear to our eyes. The Bible tells us in Romans 6:23, as I said before, that the wages of sin is death, and so how can someone deserving of death, as we all are, sentence another to die? Going back to the example I set forth earlier of being in a situation where an evil person completely tore the person you love from yourself and committed the most disgusting acts imaginable, all I can hope for is their repentance, and that maybe someday they can find the Lord. After all, Paul murdered numerous innocent people while his name was still Saul. And that's not to disparage any of the awful, terrible, agonizing pain and suffering that human beings are capable of causing, but just to point out that it is up to God and that person's ultimate rejection or acceptance of him, and not anyone else to determine life and death. Ultimately, we look to God for guidance and pray for restoration in a broken world. And before we can decide who dies and who doesn't, we first have to look to the one who decided that we should live in the first place, and have the chance to have this debate at all.